Throughout the series, we have explored the foundation theory. The first step was about existence. We then discovered that nothing is outside all of existence, and thus nothing outside existence caused or explained existence. From here, we proposed the foundation theory, and that existence has a foundation, and this foundation is the basis for all dependent things. We then discovered that this foundation is independent, that it does not depend on anything else, that it is necessary, that it exists in all possible worlds and has to necessarily exist, that it is eternally powerful, that it has power and this power has always existed, and finally that it is purely actual and that it has no arbitrary limits. In this video, I'm going to go over how the foundation theory can explain the existence of our minds. When we do this, we will discover an important aspect of the foundation that provides us many clues as to what the nature of the foundation of reality is. Let's begin. To begin, let's first understand what a mind is. A mind is capable of thinking, making decisions, and feeling different things. In fact, if you're watching this video, then you have a mind. That is, that you are a conscious mind and have experience. Minds are very strange because they have emotions, thoughts, hopes, and feelings. But yet we can conceive of a world with no emotions, no thoughts, no hopes, and no feelings. Experiencing these mental feelings are all within consciousness. If you take a second to think about your own consciousness, you cannot fully contain it in one thought, because you are currently conscious of your own consciousness. So your consciousness extends beyond what you can think of. In other words, you can never step outside of what it is like to be conscious. All your thoughts, feelings, emotions, etc. all happen in consciousness. Consciousness is anything where there is something it is like to have such mental activity in and of itself. And so we need an explanation as to how this consciousness that we all experience exists. There are two hypotheses which may be able to explain consciousness. The first hypothesis is what is called the foundational mind hypothesis. And according to this hypothesis, the mental reality of consciousness is foundational to the rest of reality. And so there is nothing outside of mental activity or consciousness. In other words, according to this hypothesis, the foundation for reality is consciousness, and that you cannot reduce consciousness to something else. So in short, the foundation for reality is mental. The second hypothesis is what is called materialism. On this hypothesis, the foundation for reality is mindless. And so, since the mind is not foundational to reality, then minds are the byproduct of a complex pattern of non-mental things. In other words, according to this hypothesis, the foundation for reality is mindless, and our minds are the byproduct of this mindless foundation. Now, what I will be arguing here is that the foundational mind hypothesis is a more parsimonious and better hypothesis over and against the foundational mindless hypothesis. The first thing to point out here is that the foundational mindless hypothesis faces a construction problem. As we mentioned before, a construction error results from building something with the wrong materials. To understand why non-mental things producing mental things commit a construction error, we must start beginning to look at what minds possess. The first aspect of mind is qualia. The second aspect is private access, and the third aspect is the power to choose. Qualia are the feeling aspects of sensations. When you eat watermelon, for example, it will feel and taste a certain way. However, if we contrast qualia with nonsense features of unconscious bits of matter, like dust, we understand that dust has third-person characteristics like shape, motion, mass, and so on. Third-person properties leave out first-person properties that characterize felt experiences. For example, If we build a robot, we can have the robot function as if it had a sensation, but it is not actually the same as having sensations. A robot could scratch its leg without actually feeling anything. All of this goes back to the hard problem of consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness is the problem of experience. When we think or perceive of things, there is information processing, but there is also a subjective aspect. Everything is conscious if there is something it is like to be that organism. It is not about the performance of functions, such as how neurons operate. The hard problem, however, goes beyond the performance of functions. And so, even when we have explained all of the functions, then we need to ask why the performance of these functions are accompanied by experience. Information processing and functioning of the brain, no matter how complex, can go on in the dark without any inner feelings. Materialist theories assume the existence of consciousness and then use it in the explanation of brain processes. For any proposed brain process or system, we can always ask as to why it gives rise to experience. Now, one objection to the hard problem is that it is simply vitalism in disguise. Vitalism is the thesis that no physical account could explain life, and that this is analogous with the hard problem. What drove vitalism was skepticism about physical mechanisms which could perform the many remarkable functions associated with life, such as complex adaptive behavior and reproduction. The problem, however, is that life is a purely functional process. With consciousness, a physical explanation of the functions is not a question. The key is instead the conceptual point that the explanation of functions is not sufficient for the explanation of experience. Functions can explain how life arises, but the same functional mechanisms say nothing about conscious experience. This even applies to any mechanism as to how consciousness could even emerge from matter. The alleged cases of emergence are not qualia, rather they end up smuggling in qualia into the causes. Furthermore, all of the cases of emergent things we find is that third-person properties will always give rise to more third-person properties. The next aspect of the mind is our private access to it. However, a neuroscientist does not have access to our private mind. If a scientist opens up your brain, the scientist witnesses third-person aspects like mass, motion, and molecular structure. In other words, the scientist is able to look at the third-person properties. However, our thoughts do not have these same properties. It makes no sense to describe thoughts or beliefs with physical parameters. Thoughts do not have dimensions or weight. It doesn't make sense to describe beliefs as being next to one another or on top of one another within your brain. The inner mental world seems completely devoid of physical properties like size, position, and mass. Another argument is that it seems that physical things can affect consciousness. If this is the case, then it seems that brain activity does give rise to conscious experience. The problem is that it makes an error in the connection between the brain and the mind. A connection between the brain and the mind does not demonstrate that the brain is the source of the mind. Those that accept the foundational mind hypothesis do not deny that there is a connection between the mind and the brain. Correlation is not causation. Even if you have causation, it is question-begging to assume that the cause is purely mindless. The problem with physicalism and materialism is they try to construct consciousness out of things that refuse to add up to consciousness, trying to build first-person experiences of things experienced within our first-person experience. Consciousness doesn't seem to be a process, a function, a thing, or a property. Rather, it seems to have its own category. All things are experienced in consciousness and can never escape such a construct. Thus, the hard problem at its core suggests consciousness does not reduce to matter. Now, there are three ways that we can explain why there are minds. The first is to say that there are no minds. The second is to say that the mind simply is third-person matter. And the third way is to argue that fundamental mentality supplies the resources to solve the hard problem of consciousness. The first way is to simply deny that there are minds in the first place, and thus there is no hard problem. Now, if there are no minds, then there are no thoughts, feelings, or emotions. Yet, we know that we have those things. If you think that you have no thoughts, then you have the thought that there are no thoughts. So this position is self-refuting. The second proposal is to reduce first-person aspects of the mind to purely third-person aspects of the world. So, for example, your sense of happiness is just some pattern of particles in your brain. However, there are a lot of issues with this proposal. The first is to realize that feelings do not have any physical parameters. A feeling has no shape or size. Even when you feel a triangle, for example, the feeling aspect of the itch is not the same as the triangular shape. We can see that certain sensations are not the same. Having the sensation of sadness is not the same as being happy. If we use our direct awareness to test the hypothesis, then there are a lot of things we can discover. The hypothesis is simply that mental aspects are nothing but third-person aspects of matter. So when neurons fire in a particular way, there is a certain mental sensation. A sense of an itch is different from physical parameters, and you can use this to compare your sense of an itch with any complicated pattern of shapes, motions, network, or functions. Furthermore, the hard problem of consciousness has nothing to do with how complex something is. The problem is that neurons are the wrong category of things to produce minds. Just as prime numbers are the wrong materials for constructing a mind, so too neurons or anything we experience are the wrong materials for constructing the central aspects of sensations. Furthermore, as we pointed out before, minds include first-person, privately accessible experiences. So now that we have gone over the proposal, the next proposal is that we need more resources other than matter to produce minds. I believe the foundational mind hypothesis can explain minds. If mentality exists at the foundational layer of reality, then this foundation could be the ultimate cause of all first-person experiences that minds have. The foundation itself would include a first-person experience. In fact, the foundation itself would be consciousness, and thus the foundational mind could construct first-person properties from first-person sense properties. The foundational mind would also have private accessible to its own mental states, and therefore it would be able to produce other things with their own mental states. And finally, since the foundational mind would have the ability of choice, then it could also give us the ability of choice. Mind is primary. Without any foundational mentality, the building materials are fundamentally different. Consciousness requires the right category. The right category of consciousness is the mental, and so we need a mental aspect of the foundation for reality to explain why consciousness exists. A mind-like foundation provides the materials to construct all other mental aspects of reality. In our next video, we will be explaining how the foundation theory can explain the existence of matter.